So how many of you saw Babe? I'm dating myself a bit. Babe, can you do the chant? Ba ram you, ba ram you. So for those of you who didn't see Babe, so that's how the world hears sheep, right? Ba ram you. But Babe was able to hear past that and was able to hear with his heart in such a way, and we talked a little bit about heart talking last week, but he was able to hear in such a way that he actually accepted that they were conscious creatures. And really, they didn't like being pushed around. So unlike the dog that was hurting them, he actually said, you know what? Could you just like move over here a little bit? Because it would just make life so much easier, and the humans will really appreciate it. Can you do that for me? And it was just the most delightful thing. Because sometimes we all get into a little bit of a herd mentality. And even the herd gets into a herd mentality. And we are not even aware that we're in a herd mentality, which is part of the problem. So in Science of Mind, what we like to call this is race consciousness. So as in human race consciousness. So the idea being that there's this, thing out there that operates, and we don't even realize that it's sort of running our program on a subconscious kind of level. Carl Jung also talked about it a little bit, and he referred to archetypes. So we have certain kinds of archetypes that maybe are running our program. So there's the magician archetype, but then there's also the victim archetype, and then there's the warrior archetype. And depending upon which archetype we're using, or depending upon which human race consciousness we're operating in, that can affect how we are seeing the world. So this is all that sub-programming stuff that we're not even aware of until we run into a challenge. So this month, what we're actually focusing on is lifelong learning. And it's interesting because I think for those of you who were here last month, we were focusing on inclusivity and diversity. And of course, this month we're focusing on lifelong learning. And so what's happening to me this week, I'm actually going to a lifelong learning conference put on by CSL in Kelowna on Friday. I don't think they actually planned it like that, but it's all perfect, right? So the idea that we are an educating, open-minded, we always need to have a new idea, teaching is actually fundamental to who we are. So it's fundamental because the idea being that we are constantly working with a new thought, and we're constantly trying to change the way that we think to improve it. It's not because it's wrong, it's not because it needs fixing, it's just if we have the ability, because we're human beings, to be conscious and to use our mind, doesn't it make sense for everybody that we use it in as many ways as possible and as effectively as possible so that we create a better world that works for everyone? That's the underlying thing. So the official line for our theme, which all the CSLs are following all over the world, those who are choosing to, and we certainly are choosing to, it says, we walk a path of awakening, growth, and spiritual deepening through classes, workshops, seminars, and spiritual practices that allow us to embrace education as a lifelong endeavor. So it is part of us, and that's why I so frequently refer to it as a philosophy or a teaching as opposed to a religion, because it is a way of thinking, and sometimes we just do need a little bit of training for that. So in the Science of Mind, what he talks about is, Ernest Holmes says, to each is given what he needs, and the gifts of heaven come alike to all. How shall we use these gifts is all that matters. So there's no inequality up here in our consciousness. If there's any inequality that you perceive in your life or in your experience, that's human created. Our spiritual consciousness, our own minds, we have choices that we are able to make to create a new experience. So even if we're having a challenge, and some of the challenges, as we know, can be incredibly big, and maybe it's an entire country that's experiencing a challenge, right? Wars or things like that. So how do we move our consciousness and overcome that so that eventually we can become that Holocaust survivor that's willing to embrace the granddaughter of the Nazi. That takes work. That takes a lot of work, right? But we all want to get there, because if we can get there, then that means that we have transformed ourselves. We've transmuted ourselves. We've allowed that greater spirit and that greater consciousness to start to operate from within. And that is a powerful thing. So I want to give a little few examples of what happens, because it's really easy for us to say, well, you know, I'm open-minded. It's those other people that are closed-minded. So here's just a few really basic examples of what that might look like. So when I was a little kid, little kid, about 6 or 7 years old, I lived in a small community, and it was one of those interesting houses where everything was just all on one floor. There was no second floor, and this is important for me to tell you this. So I climbed out of my bedroom window. So I want you to know I didn't climb out of the second floor. I climbed out of my first floor bedroom window because I'd heard something outside, and it was about, must have been quite late because it was the summer, and so it was probably after 9 o'clock, like I'd probably been in bed for at least an hour. And the reason why I climbed out of my bedroom was because there was a raccoon outside, and I wanted to say hi. So I climbed out of my bedroom with my nightgown on, and I got onto the concrete patio, and I still remember the feeling of the concrete, and this little raccoon, who was probably, you know, I'm only 7, right? So I'm thinking maybe we're kind of the same size. Maybe he's probably a little smaller than me, right? But anyway, it put its paw right on top of my hand. And I can still remember the feeling of its claws. And then I pulled my hand away, and I thought, okay, I think I'm going to get into trouble if I do this for much longer. So I climbed back up into my bedroom. So how many people, when you hear that, go, I want to show of hands? Did that freak you out? Like, no? Okay, good. Okay. So here's a story that I just heard this week, because often when I tell that story, people say, raccoons are really dangerous. You know, it could have had rabies. It could have really hurt you. It could have clawed you, blah, 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 blah. And my stepson, who has just moved to Korea, sent me a picture this week. And what is it? It's of a raccoon cafe in Korea. You know how we have cat cafes? People go in and cuddle cats. They're cuddling raccoons. Now here, we would never cuddle a raccoon, right? Interesting. But you can. You can. They had a different idea about that. Here's another story. This is somebody else who I was talking with this week, and they had just got back from a trip to Guatemala. And so the experience was very different for them. They went on this trip, and when they came back, they said, yeah, you know, most people do all their grocery shopping in the market as opposed to in a supermarket, like the way we have it here. And it was really strange because, you know, I felt really uncomfortable because, you know, their eggs, they did not put their eggs in the fridge. And I said, they don't do that in Europe either, you know. She was like, really? They don't do that in Europe? No, they don't. In fact, most of the world, they don't actually put eggs in the fridge. We're the weird ones. She's like, really? And so I'd read this recently, and apparently the reason is because of salmonella, but there's 2 ways you can get salmonella. One is from the outside of the egg. Like, it either comes from the egg itself or it comes from the hen that lays the egg. So the choices are you wash the egg, which is what we do here, and from the moment you wash it, then you don't have to keep it in a fridge, or you take care of the chicken so it doesn't get sick. You vaccinate the chicken, apparently. That way it doesn't get sick, and therefore you don't need to have all that infrastructure to keep your eggs in the fridge. Totally different construct, right? Interesting. So this is all about the idea of being engaged, being open, and being open-minded. That when we're open-minded, then we can see things in a different kind of way than how we maybe have seen them up to that point. So our idea of being closed-minded, there's a whole bunch of reasons why we end up that way. We can end up there because of fear. You know, we get the tunnel vision. We can end up there because of preconceptions. we can end up there because of assumptions. That's one of my favorite ones. I use that one a lot. And it's never, ever, ever a good idea, because you start making decisions based on your assumptions. Now you're over here, and the truth was actually way over here. So you're now way off base, only because you never stop to ask an open-ended question to test the assumption that you've already made. Judgment is an obvious one that closes the mind as well. And then the one that we don't like to talk about a whole bunch, but the word ignorance, and which just means you just don't know. The challenge, of course, is that you often don't know that you don't know. I know that sounds like George Bush, but there are the things we know, the things we know we don't know, et cetera, and things we don't know. But it's true. We make decisions based on those too, based on our ignorance, based on not actually having all of the information available to us. In some ways, that's a little easier because it's a little bit more like innocence. But as we become adults and we're in charge of our mind, we get to be able to start to think a little bit more about whether or not we really want to do that. So with the idea of moving into learning and being teachable, in order for us to really get a new idea and be teachable, we need to have suspend our disbelief, actually. We have to suspend our disbelief if we want to take in a new idea. And this often happens in the beginning of science of mind classes, where you've got a whole bunch of people in a class, and some people they're all at different levels of understanding about how do we experience cause and effect in our lives, how do we get to have a thought and it actually outpictures into our experience. That just sounds kind of not possible, so, is that really true? And we slowly start to work on what that experience is like. As we start to actually try and use things like spiritual mind treatment that Janet did a lovely demonstration of, we start to experience real demonstrations. We start to see how different it is if we step into believing, and so it is, step into believing that this is the truth of who I am. So I want you to know, as a point of self-declaration, I think I'm up to 23 years in this practice, and I can tell you that it took forever for me to go and ask for a spiritual mind treatment. Like, when I say forever, I mean, I don't think I actually asked for one for maybe a year and a half, and I went into classes right away. And it took me longer to actually make it part of a daily practice. And I think the reason why it was so difficult for me was because in theory, I got it. I really got it. But in practice, I was scared. I was actually scared about what would happen what would my life be like if I actually started unpacking all of those false beliefs I had? What would my life really be like if I actually said, you know what, I really need to treat for self-love, because I'm pretty good at loving others, but man, not so good at loving myself. What would it look like if I started to really believe that I was perfect, whole, and complete? I don't think I'm ready for that. So maybe I would try for something just a little easier, right? But I just had to keep opening my mind up to that as a possibility. So even on the inside of this teaching, the challenge to continually be opening up so that we can transform who we are at our root is an ongoing practice and an ongoing exercise. It is not for the faint of heart, and yet anyone who does it and practices it gets massive rewards out of it, because this starts to see how things shift and change, and sometimes very, very quickly. So I want to give you a concrete example. I think my very first treatment was actually when my marriage was falling apart. I mean concentrated treatment. It probably wasn't my real first treatment, right? But when I really started to, okay, I'm going to work on something. And this was a marriage that was not a good marriage, in my estimation. Otherwise, I wouldn't have decided to end it. But the one thing that I wanted to make sure of was that we ended it with as much love as possible, and that we ended it in such a way that our daughter knew that both of us were there for her 1,000%. Because we were going to be co-parenting, and I wanted to do that with peace and with love. And so we did that. We co-parented her all the way from kindergarten straight through to the end of grade 12, straight through to her moving to Vancouver. And I was just at the bank yesterday and just making a deposit, and they said, oh, you've got a dormant account. Do you want to reactivate it? And I said, yeah, I think actually I probably do want to keep that one active. It's the one account that we had jointly. We never shut it down because we wanted to make sure that financially our daughter would continue to be easily supported without worrying about things like, have you got the signing authority on the trust fund, et cetera, should anything happen to either one of us. And so it was a foundational principle, and if I hadn't been able to continually say, yes, I believe that this person who I no longer want to be married to, but who I think is an important person in my life, an important person in my daughter's life, I need to be able to see him as whole. And in order for me to do that, I need to continually work on this practice so that I can let go of those pieces that no longer serve me, but not let go of the humanity, right? Not let go of that inner being of who that person is, because that too is spirit. And whatever this is that we need to work out is the two of us trying to figure out how does spirit work and what do we want to do with it. So we need to be, as within this teaching, our aim is to be teachable and our aim is to be reachable. If we put barriers up that don't allow us to sort of, especially when we're working with a practitioner, to sort of very gently, very kindly kind of go in and go, okay, what's that piece? What's that little piece there, right? That could be your breakthrough. And so many times people are like just on the edge, right? You've probably been there, just on the edge of that big breakthrough, and you step back, right? Because that feels familiar, that feels safe, that feels good. But if you can trust and know that you're in good hands with trained people who understand and can see the truth of who you are and are actually guiding you to be even more of who you already are, then that's a thing of beauty. And that will give you much joy. But it's not easy, but that's okay. It's not easy to do most great things in life. In fact, I can't think of any really great thing in life that people just figured it out, right? So we need to allow room for new ideas, new beliefs to emerge. We need to allow room for new voices in the room, voices that maybe we don't want to hear, and say maybe there's an opportunity for us to hear and hear something different. Listen to other perspectives while practicing non-judgment. All of these things will help to make us more reachable and in turn more teachable and help us to have that greater experience. So the last thing I wanted to give you was a quote again from Ernest Holmes. What he says is, humanity's experience is the logical outcome of inner vision. Our horizon is limited to the confines of our own consciousness. Whenever this consciousness lacks a true perspective, its outward expression will lack harmony. This is why we are taught to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, since no one lives by proxy, but each one unto him or herself. Every individual must make the test of his or her own soul. So we can help you on the journey, for sure, but really it's up to you. And that's the practice, that's the teaching. It's up to each and every one of us to figure out what our journey is and figure out our best expression of that journey. I love that because it keeps me engaged, frankly. It keeps me occupied, and I need that. So I'm going to give you two more that are really good so that you know that this is a principle that operates not just here in this place, but also has been going on through the ages. So this is from Romans in the Bible, and it actually says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God." So that's 2,000 years old. And then Emerson, my buddy from the 1880s or so, he said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." I always like that. I like the image of a hobgoblin. I've had a few hobgoblins in my life. So for homework, here's the thing. If you hear the word should on yourself, shoulding on yourself, or if you're shoulding on someone else, that's an opportunity for you to open your mind, because we do not should on anyone, including ourselves. So thank you very much. Namaste.